So welcome to our second podcast. And today we thought we would talk about the one of the what we call the three fundamentals of the Shrink app, for those of you that are not already using it. And to describe what those are, Andreas and I talked about this briefly before, but we'll talk about one of the fundamentals in more detail during this podcast. But now, to give you an overview, our perspective with Shrink is that really when you think about all the mental health issues and just general ups and downs that people experience in their lives, you can broadly group them into three categories. So when people express worries and concerns, be that in therapy or to their friends or even to themselves in the dead of night, they tend to group around three topics. The first is important, or maybe even not so important, but just worrisome or difficult decisions that people have to make, trouble or issues with relationships. And the third one is things within yourself that you are confused about or don't quite understand. So patterns of thought or behavior that you seem to be stuck in, that don't serve you well, but you can't quite understand where they come from or why you keep perpetuating them. So those are our three fundamentals. And today we thought we'd focus on one that I think is particularly relevant actually as we come out of lockdown, which is how we make decisions. Andreas, do you want to run with that?
Sure, thanks, Claire. I think often when people come into therapy, one of the big questions they bring is, what should I do? And that really positions this whole conundrum of making a decision, because the world is full of different options, the world is full of different sort of opportunities. And of course, having to choose in all of that is quite problematic sometimes for people, because if everything was logical and rational, of course, it would be very simple because there would be obvious routes that we should take through our lives. And a lot of reading around decisions really kind of looks at that. So they get rid of the ambiguity. And once you get rid of the ambiguity, you'll be fine. You'll know exactly what kind of decision to make. That is seeing us as these rational, almost computer model beings who don't really have a lot of feelings, hanging sort of being sort of in tune with their affect in a way. And of course, in any decision, there is at the heart, I believe, a conflict. It's a conflict between what I want and then on the other hand, what I should be doing. And people go back and forth, and that's where you get the sleepless nights from. So I really want to do this, but should I really be doing something different? And at the end of that, of course, is that sort of we're not always aware of where that conflict lies. We're sort of not quite sure, what really is it, and therefore, I think people call it procrastination. And yet there is something I think that we need to look at, Claire, as well, is that this idea that actually sometimes people don't want to make a decision. They want to hang back almost from wanting that decision, and they'd rather stay in that space of not knowing.
That's right. And I think it can often take people a long time to realize that that's what they're doing. And I'm sure, you probably have experienced this a lot as a therapist, is that people will tend to come thinking that they have to make a decision. It will often be around a crisis or a point of change. And the premise from which they start is that decision, or there is a decision somewhere that needs to be made. And actually, that's not always the case, is it? Maybe it's more about learning to tolerate the fact that there are these conflicts and uncertainties in our life.
People are surrounded by these narratives of change is the only constant, and the status quo is not an option. And I would very much argue that status quo is an option for a lot of people. Actually, I think sometimes if you're not sure what to do, doing nothing is a really useful thing to do, because it does allow you to get a deeper understanding in things. And I think people feel under a lot of pressure to make decisions, to kind of shoot from the hip and kind of think, okay, there's some time pressure here, I have to call it. And usually I sort of work with people in that way of sort of thinking, where does that pressure come from? What is that pressure about? Why do you feel that you can't actually tolerate a little bit more of this ambiguity? And sometimes actually increasing one's tolerance for ambiguity is probably far more productive for them than feeling that you have to change or you have to shift something. Change is a really tricky thing, because when you change, and in the context of decision making, ultimately you make a choice. This is all about choices. And when you commit to one particular choice, you also unchoose all the other possibilities. And that's why I think what makes it so difficult is that every change also involves a huge amount of losses. There's a lot of losing to be done. When you nail your colors to the mast, there's a lot of masks you don't nail your colors to. There's lots of alternative paths. There's lots of alternative avenues that you could have taken. And I think that creates quite a bit of anxiety in people. And that's why if you see someone and you kind of think, oh, for God's sake, just make up your mind. You're thinking, no, this person is really very, very carefully considering or troubled by, do I need to do this right now? Do I have to really make a decision? Because the whole world pressures me to make the decision. Do I really have to? And it's almost creating that space. That's one element. I think the other element is really, and that this is what we're doing with the shrink exercises, is really kind of seeing how can we separate these different voices in our heads, almost the voices that say, what do I want? What do I really want? What do I ought to do? What should I do? What's for the best? You see, there's two very different flavors to these questions, and these are the questions that lie in conflict. And teasing them apart can be really useful.
Yeah, and I think a really good example of that is when people think about their jobs. And I would say, I suppose, actually, maybe their careers, their kind of future working lives. This, and I've worked with a lot of people thinking about change or thinking about embarking upon their careers and what to do next. And there is a lot of sifting through what are the competing voices or scripts or ideas in their heads. And one of the topics that comes up very strongly for people making career decisions is words in their head and ideas in their head that actually don't come from them at all, but come from often their parents or people in their family who've exerted a huge amount of influence on them. And it's not about blaming their parents for putting undue pressure. It's just that a lot of us carry the kind of unfulfilled desires and ambitions of our parents on our shoulders. And I think a lot of people will recognize, certainly in my generation, it was all about being a professional. It was being a doctor or being a lawyer, having something that had standing. And I think a lot of children carry those desires with them. And actually, do they reflect what they want? Maybe they do, but often they don't. And I think sorting through those voices and identifying that actually those voices don't come from them and that they can let them go without feeling that they've failed is a really important part of that decision-making process, which is really where the app comes in turning those conflicting ideas into different speech bubbles, different voices in your head.
This comes straight back to the original sort of question I was talking about. This kind of parents going to children, what are you going to do when you grow up? That sort of very heavy question that's always there. What you going to do? What you going to do? And then kids are going, I don't know. And I think parents and teachers feeling incredibly frustrated by this, thinking you have to make up your mind, you have to commit, you have to do this. And of course, there isn't always that. And then people commit to going to do certain jobs or take certain paths, and then realizing at the end of it that this is not at all what they wanted to do. So, their own desires versus the sort of the disciplining voices in their heads were kind of a little bit unbalanced. So I think, make no mistake, I think even the tiniest decision is influenced by these echoes of voices of how we should be and what we should be doing and what it's like being in the world.
Yeah, and I think another point, once you've even done that, then you sort of build up to making this big decision, and then suddenly you think, well, that's going to change my life and I'm going to live happily ever after now. And obviously sometimes you're setting yourself up for an inevitable sort of disappointment. Is it possible that the decision, actually, that the living out of the decision never can live up to the expectation that you've placed on it? And in some ways there is that sort of excitement and possibility around the decision you've got to make. And once you've made it, that's gone. And you've said goodbye to the other possibilities. And now you're living with the reality of the decision that you've made.
And there's a big gap in your life. That whole time that your mind was spending on kind of, ruminating on, is this right, is this not right? Now you've done it, and the first reaction you have is maybe a little bit of relief, but hot on the heels of the relief comes also this emptiness, this sense of, oh my God, what have I done? And now I have, where do I put all this worry or this energy that I've just experienced? It has to go somewhere. And that's why people feel a little bit sort of, while we all know, I think, that there are no sort of magical solutions and silver bullets, a little part of us still believes that if we make the right decision, something will emerge and things will kind of feel a little bit better. And of course it might, and it's important, but something will also not hit the spot quite in the way we think it might have done before we were making the decision. And that is really important to acknowledge, I think, and therapy allows you to work through that. So separating your desires from the rules that have been imposed on you, I think, are really, really important things. Another example that springs to mind is choice of life partner, for example. When you kind of, people go dating, and they try out potentially different relationships, and all of a sudden they have to then commit to, is this the one? So I have to choose out of all these alternatives, I have to choose one, or maybe not, but I think generally there is that sort of pressure, that there is still that norm that one has to choose, and it's a very important choice. And begs the question, how can that relationship survive all the expectations that are being placed on it?
Yes, I was thinking about that because I was thinking about the Friends reunion, after 20 odd years or whatever it was, and how that whole series was built around two of the characters making a decision about each other. Will they and won't they? And then in the end they do, and the series ends, because after that it just becomes a boring kind of relationship. So it's not sitcom worthy in the same way. And I think we have so much investment in the choice and the choosing and the build up to it and the romance and the happy ever after, that the reality of it as you make the daily decisions, actually, and the daily life choices that are part of being a relationship are not as exciting and interesting as that initial choosing, the will she, won't she.
Yeah. And yet I think I would argue that even the micro decisions will still have the same or similar blueprints to the massive big decisions. So it's really important to see them all as part of a whole, which is in essence a conflicted human being that has lots of conflicting demands and needs and wants, and somehow has to navigate a way through that. And that's just sort of within the person. If we then move to the next fundamental, then we have to then build a relationship with people who similarly have to struggle with their own desires and what they should be doing, and all the demands placed on them. And you can sort of see that it potentially creates a perfect storm.
Yeah, and that takes us very nicely to the end of today's 15 minutes of therapy. I mean, I hope we've helped you kind of understand that thinking about decisions is not a kind of one-off event where you list pros and cons and then make your decision and move forward, that it's actually an ongoing process where you think about all the things around it. So the loss involved, thinking about all the competing pressures, and that probably the decision will be constantly revisited, possibly, as you move forward in time. And that's really what Shrink is about, helping you navigate these choices in your daily lives. And I think in our next podcast, we're going to look more closely at relationships, how we navigate them, and how Shrink can help you in making sense of them. So thank you. And that's the end of this podcast, this 15 minutes of therapy. Thanks.